fellow YouTube. I got a new camera. Someone was very kind to send this to me, and I don't know what the whole protocol is for whether or not I should name that person. I could understand why that might be uneasy to them, but I just want to say thank you specifically. This is wonderful. I think it looks better, even though right now I'm in this kind of weird noir lighting situation. Nonetheless, hopefully you can count my pores in South Korea. So I want to think a little bit further about the idea, or the relationship, I should say, between belief and identity. It seems to me that declarations of belief are innately bound up with declarations of identity. If someone says, like Mendham would, I am an antinatalist, this statement seems to suggest that there is a part of my being, right, because I am, the infinitive of which is to be, right? I am, there's something about my being that is shaped by antinatalism in this example. I'm not an antinatalist, it's just the first ism that popped into my head. This seems important because if I say I am an atheist, that means that it's that sentence not in virtue of the definition of the word atheism, but rather in definition of the statement I am. The statement I am an atheist seems to suggest that there is something about my being that is constructed or delineated or defined through this lack of belief. It's marked in some way by this lack of belief. How I interact with the world is in some way marked by this lack of belief. Saying I am an atheist seems to me to be fundamentally different than saying I am not a theist, which would be a statement of what I am not. Whereas I am, in the affirmative, you're claiming that this lack of belief is formative of who you are and what you are. At least I think it is. And I think there's, in the sort of bionic dance consideration of what the word atheism means, and plenty of other people make this kind of statement, we tend to think of atheism as kind of an abstract, almost platonic definition. Atheism is merely a lack of belief in God. I think what people mean to say when they say atheism is merely a lack of belief in gods is that you cannot hold me accountable for the actions of other atheists. You cannot put me into a box on the basis of my labeling myself an atheist. I am in no way committed to some kind of politics or ethics on the grounds of this lack of belief. Now, I think that's true. I think that you can be an atheist and believe in all sorts of politics. But I think if you look at someone like Ayn Rand, her atheism does inform her politics. If you look at Karl Marx, his atheism definitely informs his politics. Now, these two figures are on radically opposite sides of the spectrum, and both of them cite atheism as something essential to what they're thinking about. What the Marxist who says you cannot tell anything about my politics in light of my atheism alone, when they say that, what they mean is you cannot assume that I am a Randian objectivist because I am an atheist, because I'm not a Randian objectivist. I derive radically different consequences from this lack of belief. And I hope people derive consequences from their lack of belief in a God. When we talk about atheism as a kind of abstract position, we seem to ignore the concrete reality of discourse that we are embedded in. It's as though there is no world. You either affirm this proposition or reject this proposition in a vacuum. I don't think that's how that works. I think it's probably pretty obvious from my YouTube channel that I'm going to reject that out of hand. Now, I'm only making a claim for myself here. I'm not attempting to speak for any other person. But what I feel is that I, particularly as an American, live in a certain context. I live in a world of social relations that are shaped and formed by all sorts of forces. In America, many of those forces are tied to, just historically and culturally and even institutionally, to various notions of religion, and in particular Christianity, and in particular various forms of Protestantism, and in particular forms of what's called fundamentalist Protestantism. When I say I am an atheist, it's always against that background. On the one hand, yes, there is the statement, I lack a belief in God, implicit in that. But when I say this, in this context, I'm also saying I am dissociating myself from those political forces that I deem to be illegitimate. And I deem them to be illegitimate in virtue of the fact that I lack a belief in God. There seems to be something inherently political at work in that statement. And again, you can derive those consequences out in any way you see fit. But something about how we are formed by the power relationships around us, and how we relate to those power relationships, and how we conceive of those power relationships, particularly in America, is very much bound up with our notion of theism. And I think that you can see this in polls. I don't think that it's a coincidence that so many atheists are, for instance, pro-choice. I don't think it's a coincidence that the vast majority of atheists are for gay marriage. And I don't think that that's a coincidence because the arguments made by pro-lifers in general, and the arguments made by people who are against gay marriage in general, the arguments made for why creationism should be taught in classrooms, etc., all of those arguments are either made explicitly on theological grounds, or they're made in such a way that they're clearly on theological grounds, but they don't want to admit it. So if you hear people arguing against gay marriage without appealing to their God, and specifically to their Christianity, it always feels like, yeah, you're just making this argument so that you don't seem dogmatic. The fundamental drive to make that argument in the first place is still religious. Now, my atheism, right, not in some abstract plane where there are propositions that you affirm or deny in vacuums, but in the real world, my lack of belief in God delegitimates those kinds of arguments. I cannot accept political arguments on theological grounds. They seem weak and illegitimate to me. Now again, I don't mean to speak for all atheists. This is just how I interpret my own atheism, and I think people probably will agree with this. There might be some statements in here that people find maybe incendiary in some way, but as an atheist in the world, I can't get behind the pro-life argument as it's articulated by the religious right. And I can't do, the fact that I can't do that, in my reasoning at least, follows directly from this lack of a belief in God. This is all, however, I wanted to take this opportunity to state and in some ways repeat incendiary statements that I've made in the past. This is all, to me, tying back to the sort of conversation I've been having with myself over the past few YouTube videos about how belief forms identity. Through the word atheist, I locate myself within a certain nexus of political opinions. I locate myself outside of various social institutions, the church for one. I locate myself in a whole vast array of discourses. So there are political implications to being an atheist, especially as a content creator on YouTube. People address me as an atheist. I am bound up in a certain conversation, at least insofar as I am a YouTube personality. I am bound by a certain conversation. And I was thinking the other day about making videos about the Ninja Turtles, because I think that you can do an analysis of the Ninja Turtles that would be interesting and edifying in some way. But I sort of realized that I can't, on this channel, make those kinds of videos. When I made my videos about Batman, people got upset with me, or people gave me a little bit of shit because I reacted to Ben Affleck as Batman. So these kinds of, what this said to me is, you as a person are somebody who, when I click on your video, I am expecting a certain conversation to play out in the content of your video. And that conversation doesn't have a lot to do with Batman. As such, I recognize that Mike, the human who lives in a certain place in a certain time, is not reducible to Suicide for Celluloid. That is the channel that contains the things that I talk about. And so this is in the most literal mode that I could imagine, this is the formulation of an identity on the basis of atheism. That identity does not nearly exhaust who I am. I have plenty of other interests, but I do like doing this, and in some weird way I've carved out a piece of myself and held it up to the internet, formed a certain kind of personality, formed a certain series of relations on the basis of that, and specifically on the basis, at least in part, of my atheism. Certainly also in part of my narcissism as well. So yes, this to me is a certain form of self-actualization, which is something that's been probably a running theme in my videos for as long as I've been making videos, but it's especially come to the forefront in the past few ones that I've made. The exercise of debating on YouTube helps me to work out who I am as a human. And that's a good thing. And thank you all for watching me fumble my way through that project. And thank you for helping me to work out that project via comments, video responses, and conversations that I've had apart from the public aspect of YouTube. I guess this is in some way a response to a comment that Gary Edwards left me, where he seemed to brush off the idea of philosophy as a strategy or technique or instrument, or if you like, a technology to be put to use in the service of some notion of self-actualization. And that also ties back to the relationship between belief and identity, because in some way, participating in any kind of philosophical discourse, I don't consider myself a philosopher. I don't really consider YouTube to be a philosophical discourse in any kind of proper sense, but armchair philosophers, pretenders, right? We frauds, right? Doing philosophy helps us to work out what our beliefs are. That seems to be just an implicit part of what thought is, and what philosophy in particular is. And that process seems to me to be indissociable from some notion of identity formation. I don't know what I am independent of what I believe, in the sense that my beliefs are the piece of me that motivate me to do things and to talk in certain ways, and probably even to move in certain ways. And the issue of belief is something that's really complicated, and it's something that's really interesting, and it's something that I intend to go more in depth about with this channel soon, because it's something that I'm thinking about. Belief and identity and how those things intertwine, and what the adoption of a belief means for an identity, the extent to which I actually understand my own beliefs, and thereby the extent to which it's possible for me to actually know myself, in the Greek sense, know thyself, right? All of these are fascinating questions to me, and have kind of started to become the locus of thought for the moment, which is good, because that means I'm kind of finally over presuppositionalism. So I'm going to go edit this down, and you guys have yourselves a good night.